Welcome to Non-Beta Alpha, your source for unique insights into current market trends with host Ryan Morfin, CEO of Wentworth Management Services. Today we're discussing People's Republic of China's ESG, their standing in innovation and supply chain. We're joined by our guest Matthew Turpin, visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, specializing in U.S. policy towards the People's Republic of China.
Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, in the new Biden administration, people are talking about the need for us to have good governance, good ESG investing strategies for pensions and the public markets as a philosophical driver towards how they see their policy implementation going forward in the next 4 years. Can you talk a little bit about that paradigm of thought and what it means for private investors, public investors, pension funds, as it relates to trade with China?
Sure. Well, I think I would start with something that is probably obvious to all of your listeners, that we're going through a fundamental period of sort of a paradigm shift in the relationship between the U.S. and the PRC. One from a paradigm of seeking economic development would lead to then political liberalization, which essentially drove our policy from the end of the Cold War up until about 2015, which was to focus on how do we help the Chinese economy develop and expand, because that development and expansion will lead to political liberalization, and then they'll become a responsible stakeholder, and the human rights issues and national security issues we have with the PRC will go away, right? And it was very clear by sort of 2015 that did not seem to be happening, that in fact there was backsliding in nearly every area, and the United States would have to adopt a different strategy and approach to the PRC. And so what you've seen over the last sort of 5 years is a fundamental shift in what that looks like, right? So what does that mean for business leaders? It means that the environment that you may have sort of adopted 10, 15 years ago, which really incentivized your move to the PRC to conduct business, whether that's manufacturing or seeking to gain access to the market, those conditions, right, where you had a wider U.S. government policy which encouraged that, is increasingly going to likely make that, there are going to be disincentives to those kinds of behaviors. And so that leads to sort of conditions in which you begin to see, I think, the sort of wider backdrop of concern over environmental challenges in terms of social and diversity issues inside corporate boards, and then an increased focus on corporate governance, right? That's a growing topic across the investor community. I mean, certainly Larry Fink at BlackRock has been talking about this, in his letters to CEOs for essentially the last 5 years, right? Warning CEOs that they're held responsible for this.
Yeah, everybody wants good governance, but don't we have a double standard in the capital markets where we've got Wall Street saying, hey, we need good governance and let's do best practices, but don't worry about what's going on over in China. Don't worry about the human rights abuses, the environmental abuses. That's just business.
Yeah, and I think that contradiction is breaking down. I mean, it's very clear, right? Just this week, the statements that Nike and H&M and other sort of apparel manufacturers made back in November about not being exposed to forced labor in Xinjiang are now being brought to bear as the Chinese government and Chinese netizens are amplifying those and boycotting what's happening, right? And so this balancing act that folks have sort of operate off of for years, right? That you would abide by high standards in jurisdictions that required transparency and had strong rule of law, and that you would avoid the costs of that higher standards by actions in jurisdictions that didn't have high degrees of transparency, didn't have strong rule of law, and then you could walk between those. And I think, to a certain degree, when the U.S. and the PRC were on sort of the same tracks, like generally moving in the same direction, you could do that. You could straddle those two trains. And now those trains are pulling apart. And I think, to carry that metaphor on, it's really hard to straddle two trains as they are pulling apart, right? And you're likely going to have to pick which side you're sort of standing on. And I think that's what companies are having to sort of wrestle with right now. And so, if we are going to hold, boards, directors on boards and corporate management to really follow through with pledges around climate and environmental conditions, that has to be a global standard, because what we'll likely see is regulatory arbitrage, right? We'll see the flow of capital, the flow of business processes to places in which those costs aren't imposed, and there'll be a claim that they are fulfilling those pledges, but in reality, those pledges are not being fulfilled. And so I think, if it is that we are interested in fulfilling those sorts of standards, then you would have to sort of apply that in a globalized sense, given the fact that we live in a globalized, interconnected economy, and that therefore those things have to be transitioned throughout the market. And I think that logic is likely going to be the logic that investors, asset managers, banks, corporate boards are going to have to wrestle with. And the decision 2 weeks ago by the Department of Labor to withdraw or to suspend the final rule that the Trump administration put in place in November, which essentially directed fiduciaries, on pensions, that they didn't have to, that they couldn't use ESG considerations to shift how their funds would, where their investments would go. The fact that the current Department of Labor has now suspended that rule, and we've had the SEC, both the acting chair in the last 2 weeks and the chairman, or the chair who is nominated to take over, have both strongly said that they will push that the SEC will hold and demand material releases of information on ESG considerations. Given those conditions, it's highly likely that folks are going to be forced to account for the kinds of costs that they would be incurring inside the PRC. And so I think that's just, to me, that's a likely trajectory that, and while that may be, there may be certain folks that desire that not to be the case, right? For that not to be the way it's accounted for, I think it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to be able to separate those things out, and that we'll ultimately be forced to account for that behavior no matter where it happens in whatever jurisdiction around the world.
And just to boil it down for our listeners, I mean, what's happening in China doesn't really get on the news here, most likely because there's some conflict of interest with the media and the PRC. But what I would ask is, the correlations that I see, it's like if you were to make an unrealistic yet hyperbole here for the States, it's like the federal government is interning Lutherans in Minnesota. It's creating eminent domain of property for all successful tech companies. And it's creating more coal-based power plants than the United States even has. I mean, these ESG concerns that these social justice warriors have, how is it that they don't look at the data and the facts and realize that, as we make reforms happen in the United States, by letting a bad actor over in the East run wild, they're really fueling some of the trends they're trying to protect against?
Well, I actually think that these things are increasingly being known and increasingly being accounted for, right? So, the Washington Post released an article about a month ago on the fracturing of global fashion apparel manufacturing, given the sanctions put in place by the last administration on cotton produced in Xinjiang, and essentially blocked 87% of China's cotton exports due to its connection to forced labor inside the PRC. And we have seen global companies around the world begin to adjust to that much faster than we ever expected to, right? I gave that example of Nike and H&M. Each of them have begun to remake their supply chains, and we're watching that for multiple companies. The French food group Danone just 2 or 3 weeks ago began to take the first steps to divest themselves of dairies inside the PRC over their concerns of corporate governance over the facilities they have there. Right? We've seen actually quite a few examples of these kinds of things being put into place. I think to a certain degree, I watched these issues very closely, and I have seen over the last 3 years sort of a massive uptick of the reporting by media outlets on what's going on inside the PRC, whether this is Xinjiang, whether this is Hong Kong, whether this is cyber activity, malign cyber activity, whether this is crackdown on independent lawyers inside the PRC, any number of sort of issues. I've watched a massive uptick in this. I think to a certain degree, this is the sort of natural thing in any society, is that we tend to look at our own localized news much more closely, and therefore it may not, for those folks who aren't watching it, it may be somewhat surprising. But there has been an awful lot of reporting on this, and we are, I think, watching companies having to make those sets of decisions about what their exposure is. And certainly, given the fact that we still have in place the lion's share of the Section 301 tariffs, companies have been thinking through what is their setup. The costs that are in place don't appear to be going away anytime soon, and they are beginning to sort of make those adjustments of capital expenditures on new factories and various other things in other locations. Now that's specific for each industry and each company, and we've certainly seen some high-profile examples of things moving in the other direction, and Tesla is an example of that. But I would think there is also plenty of evidence that folks are beginning to account for this.
Well, there's a very important meeting that happened in Anchorage that I don't think got a sufficient number of press from folks that I'd like to get your opinion on, and I'm going to quote for a second the senior Chinese foreign policy official Yang Jiechi. He says, "The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength." So it seems to me the delegation that came to meet with our Secretary of State believes that they have the higher moral ground and economic ground and military power ground, and we should be subservient to a 21st century China. Is that what you heard in that statement?
Well, I've heard Yang Jiechi say that a number of times. Yang Jiechi is the same individual that when he was China's foreign minister back in 2011 at an ASEAN meeting, so the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, lectured the members of ASEAN when they had the temerity to raise on the agenda China's actions inside the South China Sea and encroachment on their sovereignty, the collective sovereignty of a number of members of ASEAN, to stand up and sort of boom that there are big nations and there are small nations, and that's just a fact. And essentially, sort of that same kind of perspective. So to a certain degree, this is not new. I mean, we've heard this from Yang a number of times before, and I think it represents a degree of fragility and paranoia from Communist Party leaders themselves, right? That they are entering a much more fractious and a somewhat hostile international environment compared to a sort of benign environment that they've largely lived in since the mid-1990s, where essentially China's rise was largely considered, by sort of the international business community and others with an awful lot of hope and optimism that it was moving in the direction of sort of peaceful development. I think it's very hard for the rest of the world to sort of believe that's the case now. And I would, remind the listeners that Secretary Blinken came back, I think, very forcefully with the remark that, he is, in his short time now and as Secretary of State, has talked to more than 100 of his counterparts around the world, and they gave a very different impression of the conditions, and that they saw the PRC's actions as being hostile, aggressive, and threatening to the international stability. And so it doesn't surprise me that is the language that Yang Jiechi uses. that doesn't necessarily mean it is the case. So I would, remind our listeners that the United States has a number of advantages and strengths, and those things have not all gone away. I would also sort of point out what I thought was a well choreographed, effort of the Anchorage meeting was placed between a number of senior level meetings, both before and afterwards, with U.S. allies, whether that was the first leaders quad meeting where President Biden hosted Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Suga, and Prime Minister Morrison of Australia the week before, or it was the trip that Secretary Blinken had made to Tokyo and to Seoul, or whether it was the simultaneous trip with the Anchorage meeting of Secretary Austin, the Defense Secretary, in Delhi, meeting with his Indian counterparts. And then for Secretary Blinken to immediately then move to NATO and to rally European allies around this, and to have the Europeans, the Brits, and the Canadians impose sanctions on China for its actions in Xinjiang that match what the United States had done under the last administration in July of 2020. And so, taken in that context, I think it looks very different, right? If we look at this narrowly for what Yang Jiechi said at Anchorage, one might come away with a position in which the U.S. was on its back heels. I see it very differently, and I think the evidence bears out that the United States actually has very strong alliances and has the consensus of quite a few countries around the world. I'd remind everyone that there are about 6 billion other people other than the ones living inside the PRC, and that population is increasingly concerned at the direction Beijing is taking this.
And I was watching a lot of the cabinet level nominations on C-SPAN. I guess that's what I do for fun on the weekends. But what I'd say is that it seems to me that, and I call it the cabinet of government versus the cabinet of bureaucrats, like the important areas of treasury, defense, justice, intelligence, they all identified and highlighted to bipartisan clapping that China was our number one national security risk going forward. Do you see that as the case? And if that is the case, why do we still have investing opportunities for our pension community to go fund our number one national security risk?
Well, I think so first of all, I do agree that what we've seen is bipartisan consensus that began to form at the end of 2015. Particularly as the PRC, closed its capital, it restricted capital flows, outbound capital flows following their stock market, crash in the summer of 2015, and the revelations about Made in China 2025, in which you started to get a serious reappraisal of what our overall approach should be towards the PRC, right? That was a year before the Trump administration came in, and so that consensus began in the sort of last 12 to 18 months of the Obama administration. It carried through the Trump administration, and I think is now fairly. It is very apparent that is the consensus view inside sort of the U.S. government and across the political spectrum, similar to the way in which between sort of 1989 and sort of 1994. There was also a debate over what our relationship should be with the PRC, right? The Cold War comes to an end. Originally, our relationship had been based around sort of a Cold War interpretation, in which we brought the PRC onto our side in a competition with the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union collapsed, it was up for grabs of what the new relationship would look like, right? And we had the massacre in Tiananmen, an awful lot of questions about whether or not we should be establishing deeper relations with the PRC. But by 1994, the consensus was that we should use economic engagement to drive political liberalization. And there were questions across the political spectrum whether or not that was the right approach, but you essentially had consensus by then. And then you sort of had full consensus by 1999 and 2000 as we approved permanent normal trade relations. And then we helped welcome the PRC into the WTO, right? So that during that period, we had a debate about what our approach should be, but by the end of it, we had consensus. And I think it's similar right now, right? We've had a period of sort of, we had an approach. That approach didn't appear to be working. We debated across party lines of what our approach should be, and we now have consensus. And so that consensus is likely to remain sort of into the out years. And I think that decisions about investing and what you're going to do are sort of trailing that policy discussion, right? So you're not necessarily going to stop doing whatever you're doing until there is more certainty about where the policy discussion is going to land. And I think it's, just in the last sort of 6 to 8 months, it's now become incredibly clear that this is sort of the direction the U.S. is moving, and that it's going to rally its allies around that. I would expect then decisions in sort of in the investment community and sort of the business community will then flow from that, right? Because they aren't going to make those decisions until they sort of see where the policy is going to land. And now we're sort of at that point in time, and then those things will unwind. And that's where I think considerations like ESG, right? The fact that the SEC is pushing forward on delisting of PRC entities that are on the U.S. stock exchanges, right? Given their fact that they don't disclose their audit work documents as required under Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Those kinds of things will push, right? There will be regulatory and sort of policy things that push us in a direction that would have folks reduce their exposure, right? It won't go to zero. We aren't going to decouple completely. It will reduce in certain areas, and we will find ourselves less exposed.
Well, I'm going to, take a step back and maybe ask you the same question, but in a different manner. We have a don't be a jerk policy at work, right? And it strikes me, if we were colleagues with China for the last 30 years, helping them stand up, get from poverty to middle class to now a very strong economy, you would think there would be some appreciation or aligned interests. But that seems to be diverging, I think, quickly. And the question is, what does China really want in the future relationship with the United States from how they're acting? Not from what they're saying, but from how they're acting.
Well, I'd first start off with, the Chinese people have done an amazing job for themselves. And it is something we should applaud. And
absolutely.
In fact, as a country, we should be very proud of what we've done to help Chinese citizens move from a period of deep poverty to sort of a Bentham utilitarianism, right? That is an incredible positive for the world that has happened. I would separate China and the Chinese people from the regime, right, that rules the PRC, right?
Yes.
This is a red aristocracy that is very concerned of its loss of power and influence given the growing sort of prosperity of the Chinese people, right? Right. The very things that U.S. political leaders across the political spectrum, whether it was President Clinton or George W. Bush, talked about in terms of we are going to engage with them economically because as they become more prosperous, they're going to want other freedoms and they're going to want other things for themselves. And that will push political change inside the PRC, right? To have the rule of law, right? To increase transparency so that you understand sort of what companies are doing in other areas. So these things that citizens are going to demand. That shift fundamentally undermines the position of the party, right? And that is what Xi Jinping and other leaders inside the party fear. And they are seeking to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want that economic prosperity, and they want to be able to sort of retain full control, right? And so it's that side that I think we've got to focus on is the sort of the pathologies of an authoritarian system, right? Who fear the loss of control and chaos from their perspective, i.e., for them, the worst possible thing to happen would be that they would lose power. That isn't necessarily the worst possible thing that would happen to the Chinese people, right? We live in countries in which there are political transitions that happen all the time, and the world doesn't end, and the world doesn't stop, right? These things can be fraught. These are very sort of stressful times, but the way in which you create a stable society is that you have a system of trading over and transitions of power, right? And the PRC, despite its 71-year history, has a very difficult time transitioning power between leaders because it is fraught, right? Xi Jinping has essentially ended the essentially 2.5 decade long process of an orderly transition and sort of a routinized process of bureaucracy within the PRC and strengthen the party's control in order to sort of strengthen his own power. And that puts us back to the very worst days of Maoist party rule. It certainly puts us back to some very disturbing times in Deng Xiaoping's rule, right, in which he removed 2 of his heads of state, Hu Yaobang and Xiao Jiang. Xiao Jiang was removed from power as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, days before the Tiananmen crackdown, and was placed in house arrest until his death in 2005. And so he remained in house arrest. He was the head of state and head of the party, and was removed because he didn't favor a military crackdown in Tiananmen, and was placed. So essentially a coup. And that's how that political system works. And that, I think, from an investor perspective, we should be very concerned about the systemic risks that come from that kind of a system in which you can't rely upon an independent judiciary. You don't have an independent media that's able to confirm things for you. This creates highly systemic risks that should be accounted for. And I think that is the concern, right? And in fact, that system does not provide the best outcomes for its citizens. And that is, I think, the centerpiece of what our concern should be. Not that we're afraid of the Chinese people or China's rise back up to its legitimate sort of place of power and things like that. Like, we want them to be on the world stage, acting responsibly and upholding an international system. We've been trying to encourage that with our policies and our investments for decades.
Well, the question is going to be, how do you get to the viewer of this conversation, the party leader who's a rational being, very highly educated, but all they've seen in their country is this system, this cycle, continuing to produce jobs and growth. How do you get them to look for a new playbook of Western values when they've been outgrowing us for the last 20 years? I mean, this may be 2021, maybe the first year that the U.S. outgrows China since 1976. And so if you're a rational, Western-educated bureaucrat in the party, how do you say, you know what, let's go take their advice and maybe go for that slower growth approach, that more stable approach? How do we communicate to the middle management of the bureaucracy that there might be a new playbook?
Well, I mean, first of all, these aren't sort of Western ideas. There are plenty of examples of countries around the world that aren't classically Western that understand this and have executed these things quite well, right? Whether it's South Korea, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Japan, I would so that sort of language I would sort of set aside, right? The other thing I would say is that we all know that trees don't grow to the sky, right? So one of the things for the massive expansions, right, had to do with the place for where they were starting, right? Which was also due to sort of the mismanagement which was entirely due to the mismanagement of the Chinese Communist Party from its founding in 1949 until Mao's death, right? In which a country that should have, after the Second World War, accelerated in the same way and brought economic prosperity in the same way that plenty of other countries in East Asia were able to do during that period of time, in fact, did not do that, largely due to the party's mismanagement of how the country ran, right? So, I think we should be, while we should be very appreciative and proud of what the Chinese people have been able to do themselves since the mid-1970s, we should also be very clear about why they were in the position they were in the mid-1970s as one of the poorest countries on the planet. It was not because they lacked natural resources. It's not because they lacked talent. It's not because they had a political system that drove them into the dirt and created these conditions. And now we have, and there was a liberalization of that, right? In which you allowed Chinese citizens to make their own decisions, and they brought great prosperity to themselves. And that is then leading them to the position where other liberalizations are likely the next steps. And we are seeing a backsliding by the party because they fear the loss of control, right? And so it is likely true that party leadership would not be as well off as the Chinese economy were to continue to transition to a greater market economy, right, in which the state had less control of what the economic outcomes were, and as citizens and other political leaders were able to rise up and challenge the status quo and push things in other directions. It is, in terms of over relative power, they would probably lose power in that. And that, I think, for them scares them very much. But that doesn't mean that isn't necessarily better off for everyone else. And that, I think, is the real dynamic that we find ourselves in. And, unfortunately, the party has developed very effective measures of control in which it is extremely difficult for other elements of society to be able to organize and present alternatives to this. And I think ultimately what we're seeing in terms of the backlash against PRC tech companies and just in the last couple of weeks and months reflects the actions, that sort of the pathologies of the party of fearing any other sort of center of power, that anything that might present a challenge to the party's rule and control, right? Chairman Xi is often known as the chairman of everything, right? Anything that challenges that control will be suppressed and broken up and put under the party's control. And so we shouldn't be surprised by that activity.
Well, let me ask you a historical question, because I think it begs the choice we have to make as investors and as Western democracies, republics. So up until the founding of the PRC, up until, I believe, when Nixon and Kissinger went there in the 70s to try to use China as a chip in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, at that point, the West made a decision to inject capital and trade flows into China to win them over to our side. And now that we've turned a few chapters forward, and now the USSR is no longer a threat. China has stood up on its own feet and developed a consumer class. Is it not time for Western leaders and companies to say, if they don't get on a playbook that lets the Chinese people have freedom, that we are just financing a more authoritarian regime like we've never seen before, and we may need to make a decision: do we need to pull out from this relationship and let them run it back into the ground, or convince them that this next leg of growth is really what they were going for from the beginning, but they do need to make some structural reforms and freedoms for the individual people in China?
Well, I mean, this has been the centerpiece of the debate, of the sort of the policy debate, for going back to the sort of early 2000s, right? The beginning, how does the PRC government make structural reforms to its own economy in order to move from its last sort of model of growth to the next model of growth, a more sustainable growth, right? 7 or 8% growth rates, are great, but they probably don't go on forever, right? There is a sort of upper limit at the number of highways, bridges, roads you can build, right? Fixed asset investment, right? Done, at high rates every single year, eventually you fill up a stock in which, building one more building doesn't actually bring you, real wealth. It's just activity. It's just production in order to drive a GDP growth. And so how do they make that transition? I mean, I think this is the center of the dual circulation strategy, which, how do you build out a consumer economy, while also having an export-driven economy? This debate about how to boost sort of the internal consumer economy, has been at the center of PRC economic policy debates, for a decade or more. They've been debating how to do this. They have not been successful yet. It is what they need to do. I think it is what certainly Liu He, Xi Jinping's sort of main economic advisor, certainly understands this is what needs to be done. But it's a political obstacle to doing that, right? That's the problem. Is that this is not that they don't understand from an economic perspective how to do this. It's because it is a political obstacle. The political implications of those changes, resound negatively on the power of the party, and that is the real challenge, right? And I think that for years we likely in the United States, and I think our colleagues in Japan and in Europe had an awful lot of faith in our ability to shape the PRC's outcomes. And I think our track record has actually been kind of quite poor. It's been good in the idea that when it aligns with what the party wants to achieve, which is economic growth, we can kind of do that together. But if we're now asking them to sort of make structural changes that will impact the sort of the political standing of the party, unlikely they're going to do that. And I think we're at the point now where we need to be thinking about the systemic risks that they pose, right? That to the broader international system. And instead of thinking about, necessarily how do we spend time changing their behavior, how do we spend time diversifying away, right? How do we spend time granting the benefits of globalization to the other countries of the world that have not benefited from the kinds of growth that the PRC has benefited from over the last 2 decades, and maybe that moving of our attention to other regions might take the pressure off the PRC that this isn't essentially us sort of staring them down to get them to make changes, but it would give them the space to make their own internal shifts, and that we could get maybe a good outcome. But we probably need to be rethinking our own exposure to the PRC.
No doubt. No, I think the milk and honey approach the West has taken to help them. If it starts to divert to other places like Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia, it's going to create some room for other thought leaders in China to say, listen, we had it so good for so long, and you guys ruined it because you weren't willing to do the right thing for our people. And I think that's what it's going to take, is a little bit of contextual awareness that what the inputs have been for their success. It's no doubt the hard work, blood, sweat, and tears of the Chinese people, but I do think it is the capital flows that has really fueled the growth, and we need to perhaps start looking for some alternatives. And I've asked people this in the past. I said, isn't it interesting that we look at our credit scores, we look at our financial bank accounts as metrics, but we don't, for social issues, look at our ESG scores. And when it relates to China, we might be well suited to start thinking about what a company's, China exposure is as a scorecard, and saying, you are funding people who are committing genocide. You are funding people who, take away property rights. You are funding a worldview that isn't compatible with the world that I think we want to live in. And if you want to continue investing in that, that's fine, but you're a hypocrite. Because what you say at the ballot box or on TV doesn't jive with how you invest your capital.
And I think you could also say it another way, right? In which, and I think this is the argument Larry Fink has made, that in fact the returns on those investments you make that are aligned with sort of the long-term interests of your broader stakeholders, right? Taking in an ESG has outperformed others. And so in fact, this isn't essentially sort of a moral or profit choice, right? Follow the moral way, but it's not profitable, or follow the profitable way, but it's not moral. I think that plenty of folks have made the argument that in fact, that is not a choice you have to make, right? In fact, those things can be quite aligned, and we should align those things, right? That those things are not divergent. That in fact, right, if we're going to make a transition and reduce our exposure to sort of changes in the climate, then maybe we should follow through and put our money against places in which there's transparency and a rule of law to fulfill the commitments that governments have made, as opposed to a place where, I mean, the number of broken international treaties and broken agreements, is quite high inside the PRC. So you just have to ask the people of Hong Kong whether or not an international agreement that Beijing signs with another country can be fulfilled, right? I mean, so it was the when 3 years ago, 4 years ago, scientists began to detect a growing hole in the ozone layer, right? After a decade or more of it being closed, because we had put the Montreal Protocol in place, in which we essentially said, the world agreed that no one would use CFCs anymore. And suddenly we began to discover in 2017, 2018, that hole was growing again. And lo and behold, we track it back, and it's 2 provinces inside the PRC. The PRC, who had signed that treaty back in the early 1990s, had said to the world that by 2015 that it was not using those things anymore. And they were then pumping out those things at such level as to reverse the progress the rest of the world had made over the preceding 2 decades, right? That is the kind.
There's no credibility. Yeah, there's no credibility in anything they say, and that's the danger. And that's why I don't think, I doubt you'll be able to get Larry Fink at BlackRock to say BlackRock's against the hypocrisy of the social impact causes that we implement in the United States, and give a free pass to the Chinese government, because it makes too much money there. And so that's the problem with, I think, a lot of these folks on Wall Street is there's a double standard. You want to act one way at home, and then you act another way with your pocketbook in China. And I just think people need to shine some transparency on the hypocrisy of Wall Street and in DC and corporate America on these issues. And consumers need to pay attention to who's actually being values-driven organizations and who's not, because it just doesn't stop at the border. I think it has to become a global value system that we implement. But you're talking about all these political issues, right? About wanting to do the right thing and not maybe being able to. Can you shed some light, because it's something I still don't have a clear view on, of the multiple different faces of China, the mosaic of Chinese political factions inside of the one-party system? Because it seems to me that Yang Chaishi is a more hardliner hawk, right? And you probably have the PLA supporting him, but then you probably have some moderate business folks, some intellectual academics. But what are the different pieces of the constituency of the PRC? It can't all be monolithic.
Right. Well, I mean, this is worth a whole other session.
We'll definitely have you back.
The internal political dynamics of the party, and so I think at your main point is absolutely right. That of course they're not a monolith. Of course there are. I mean, politics inside the PRC is a blood sport, right? Xi Jinping has been running an anti-corruption campaign, since he first came into office. And that has resulted in, hundreds of thousands of PRC, of party officials being disciplined in various things from, prison, removal from their position and prison time all the way up through execution, right? And so it is a blood sport. I mean, it is, we often don't see it that way, right? Because there is a sort of a public perception of sort of this harmonious technocrat party system, in which it's all managerial, they're all engineers, they're just trying to drive towards the best thing. But we're all humans here, and we all understand that these are there are very contentious things that go on, and much of that is being sort of hidden from our view, right? And so, in terms of the factions, I don't exactly know how to describe them all, other than to say that there certainly is, I think, a broad-based consensus across the party that it is in their mutual interest to have the party retain the powers that Xi Jinping has sort of brought back to it. I think there are very few. I mean, there are certainly some, but in terms of individuals with sort of real power, I think there are very few that we would consider sort of be sort of classic liberal thinkers of the smaller government and allow the market to. I think there are certainly some that understand that and would might advocate for that, but there is not a sizable, certainly not a sizable political mass that would advocate that position. And so I think oftentimes we're sort of led to believe that if we just let the liberals, if we just sort of back off on our pressure and we allow the liberals within that system in order to liberalize, everything will be fine. And I think to a certain degree, it's a very convenient sort of narrative for the party because it results in the removal of the pressure. And then they can effectively prevent those things from being able to actually bubble forward. So I think we're sort of stuck there. And it means that again, we need to probably concentrate less on how do we sort of tweak the internal decision-making inside the party, which is incredibly opaque. We don't have a good access on, and we probably have very few levers to be able to sort of push it, and focus much more on our own behavior. How do we change what we are doing? And that we actually have quite a bit of power over. And I think this is where the paradigm shift from, and listen, I mean, U.S. businesses and Wall Street were operating within a paradigm in which was encouraging them to do exactly what they were doing, right? In fact, that was the strategy. Like U.S. economic engagement will lead to political globalization. That means anybody who's helping to do that was actually achieving the U.S. strategy. U.S. strategy has now changed. And now because there is a trailing indicator, a trailing sort of aspect to how those things change, I fully expect that there will be a change in the way that those companies and Wall Street and various other things behave because the conditions will have changed. Now they may not like it. You may have individuals who are sort of very committed to what they were doing, but we're a disruptive sort of economy and political system. Just because somebody holds a belief now doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the way things play out.
Well, speaking of paradigms, I mean, reserve currency, does China have the wherewithal, you think, in the future to replace the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency?
I mean, I think that's still, far out on the horizon. Perhaps changes with the, a central bank digital currency might change some of that in terms of as a way in which the PRC might be able to, particularly across the Belt and Road, insist upon settlement of payments in their own digital currency. That might change some of those things, but there is a global reserve currency. There is highly based upon a degree of trust, right, and a trust in sort of the system, and while and that trust is relative, right. Yes, the U.S. has taken some hits in terms of sort of our position in the world, and folks are have been highly critical, and in some cases much of that is legitimate, but it's relative, right? And so I think it's as we move into periods of uncertainty, people go to the most trusted, right? Not it isn't like this isn't a binary question of you either trust or don't trust. It's of the things I have available, what is the most trusted? And the dollar still sort of sits in that space, right? And the renminbi, which is translates to the people's currency, and also known as the yuan, is significant. That there is a trust deficit there, right? Given the party's actions, the fact that we don't have an open capital account, we don't have those sorts of things are real limitations on the ability for folks to sort of decide to move in that direction. That doesn't mean that those things couldn't change in the future. It's still, I think, relatively unlikely, in the sort of foreseeable future that we can see right now. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be sort of aware. We shouldn't think through what the implications of that would be, right? I mean, you should always sort of think through the contingencies. But I still think we're, from a U.S. dollar perspective, we're in a pretty dependable space, and that gives us. I mean, we should be honest, that gives us some massive advantages in an interconnected global economy. And those are, there are also some exorbitant burdens that are placed upon us as well. But we also have, there's an exorbitant privilege that goes along with that particularly in a geopolitical sense. So I'm more optimistic than not.
Besides Russia, who are the other, we'll call in North Korea, who are the other nation states that are more supportive of China and the way they're acting versus, the West? I mean, you saw Biden administration go out to all of our allies, but are there some people who are on the fence or leaning more China versus the West?
Well, I mean, I think you're as you laid out. I mean, certainly, having Lavrov, go to the PRC and meet with Wang Yi immediately following the Anchorage meeting, demonstrates Russia is increasingly Moscow and Beijing increasingly see themselves as aligned. North Korea certainly is in that space, not entirely certain exactly what great advantages North Korea brings to the alliance table, but certainly presents risks and things we need to guard against. I think the Iranians obviously sort of sit in that space as well. So right, those who find themselves under pressure, from a policy and a geostrategic sense from the United States, Japan, Europe, tend to sort of lean. And then I think there are a number of countries around the world that hedge, right? They don't know how all this is going to play out, right? They certainly, I think, identify with and gain real benefits from a more stable international order, right? But they also don't know exactly what the future holds and how all of this will play out. And so, and I think the PRC has been very strong in making the case, particularly around a narrative of their inevitable rise to dominance, right? And this is I think, when we think about sort of what is commonly known as discourse power, right? The idea that you would frame a narrative and be able to sort of push that out in the world, and that becomes the internalized thought that people have about it. This concept of Beijing's inevitable rise to dominance, right? That China and that the PRC will be inevitably the most powerful country on the planet, and therefore the message to countries around the world is it's better to make a deal with us now than when we actually do get to that inevitable position of dominance, right? Because then if you stood against us in the past, well, then we're going to remember this, right? And so that's an interesting and very useful sort of narrative paradigm for them. But of course, we all know that nothing is inevitable. It is not inevitable that they will reach those positions, right? It's not inevitable that the PRC won't run into problems. It's the broader narrative of the East is rising and the West is declining, right? The United States and democracy is on its way out, and this is the new future. Get on board with it now. And you can see how that's a persuasive narrative that both Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang might want to push. But I mean, we should be honest. I mean, the jury is still out on whether or not that is in fact the case.
The Mark Twain quote is
serious challenges.
Yeah, the Mark Twain quote is the best. It says, "The rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated."
Yeah.
And you know what?
And I think Beijing, and actually, there's quite a bit of evidence that Beijing understands internally that the United States' greatest strength is its regenerative powers, right? That the rumors of our demise have been floating out there for a long time. And the regenerative power of the United States to sort of remake itself and come roaring back often catch countries by surprise. And so internally, they fully realize that. Externally, they are pushing a very different narrative, right? And that narrative is often focused at our elites who then sort of repeat it, right? And then that becomes the rationale for why you would move capital to the PRC, right? We're going this way because that's the future. Well, it's the future if we let it be the future, but like we also have contingency and agency ourselves to affect what that future looks like.
Absolutely. So question for you, are you at all concerned about the future of Taiwan? Primarily for me and from a business standpoint, not only is it a beacon of democracy in Asia, but it also is home to a lot of fabrication plants for semiconductor chips, which are critical and in short supply today. Should we be thinking after this COVID incident of, just-in-time inventory to just-in-case inventory supply chains, do we need to move our semiconductor plants back to North America?
Yeah. So, your first question, am I concerned? Of course I'm concerned. I mean, the fact that Xi Jinping himself has made it very clear that the use of force for the reunification, which is really an annexation of Taiwan, is still on the table, should be very concerning to anybody in the world, given the fact that, of the points you laid out, and the fact that, if this is the future sort of hub of global commerce, right? Well, it is the hub of global commerce. The idea of a sort of high-end conflict unfolding, in which the PRC tries to subjugate, a democracy of some 25 to 30 million people, that should be very concerning to all of us, and so we should be very serious about that. I think I'm uncertain about, so first of all, I think, the decisions by the last administration and this administration about addressing sort of our vulnerabilities across supply chains, looking at critical industries, critical inputs, and figuring out how we reduce vulnerabilities, how we increase our resilience, and whether that's the CHIPS Act, right, and then funding the CHIPS Act, in terms of semiconductors, or it's any other sort of critical and emerging industries. I think it is absolutely incumbent upon us to start doing those things, right? And it would appear that I'm not alone in thinking that appears to be sort of where the consensus, certainly in the U.S. Congress and certainly with the current administration is. I mean, this is what they're talking about. How that comes out, right, and what that looks like in terms of facilities and fabs inside the United States for a semiconductor, right? I mean, we have fabs inside the United States. We still have, we still control, particularly on the design side, important aspects of this industry. But we also have, some of the most advanced fabs in the world are, sit in Korea and in Taiwan, which for some of the contingencies, particularly military contingencies, both whether it's North Korea or it's the PRC, there are some very real geostrategic challenges and threats that reside there, in which we might find ourselves in a really difficult position.
Yeah, you can't just build one of these overnight. This takes a little bit of time and some interesting input costs. Speaking of input costs, do you believe that we're entering a technology cold war for 5G and for Internet of Things, AI and quantum? Are we entering a cold war with China, or do you still think there's room to collaborate on the tech space?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're clearly in a strategic competition, and that strategic competition is unfolding in the technology, industrial, finance, economic, and commercial spaces, right? That's where, and informational, right? Those domains, right? And where, technology or, a technological domain is a key domain of that, right? Those domains is where this strategic competition is playing out. I tend not to use the term Cold War. There is the dictionary small c, small w definition of Cold War, which is, a political rivalry, a geopolitical rivalry, between states that encompasses all elements short of kinetic conflict, right, between the two, right? So in that term, right, that small c, small w, right, that is a strategic competition, right? Unfortunately, the term Cold War, right, the big, big C, big W Cold War is a historical term, right? It centers us in thinking about the experience from 1947 to 1991, and we think about it in that term, right? And that Cold War had its own specific historical aspects to it, and had to a large degree the domains of economics and finance and technology and industry and information. Now, while information was very important in that Cold War, those other ones, we were very much separated. And so therefore it didn't unfold in similar ways. And so my fear is that terminology actually doesn't do us any favors in thinking about what the challenges are.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. And I call it economic war, economic warfare that we're in, because we're fighting for production, means of productions, capital flows, information, data integrity, privacy. But what would you call it then? Because I do 100% agree with exactly what you just said. It's Cold War is a misnomer, and it may divert our optics, like lexicon matters. What would you call it?
Yeah, so I would call it strategic competition, right?
Okay.
I would differentiate here, right? So there is, right? We often think about sort of war and peace as the two sort of, that there's a binary choice here, but we also know that just as our lived experience, that we span across a spectrum of cooperation, of competition, and conflict. And in fact, that's probably the better model to use, right? Like, we don't want conflict, right? Open conflict. We do want to compete, right? And in certain areas, we are going to want to cooperate, right? The United States is likely to want to continue to sell soybeans and various other agricultural products to the PRC for as long as they are willing to buy them, right? And the PRC, given the lack of arable land, right, in terms of water pollution and various other things, and a population, they actually need that, and it makes an awful lot of sense for them to buy it, right? And that is not something that we necessarily should want to stop, right? There are probably plenty of areas that it would be in our best interest and in PRC's best interest and the rest of the world's best interest that we cooperate on. There are also quite a few areas that we are going to compete on, and we are going to compete rigorously on. And I think that is changing, right? That in those areas were areas we thought we were cooperating on before when we followed a policy of economic development, but now we are looking at them as a competitor, and we're going to compete there. And then I think largely both sides want to avoid conflict, right? I think to a certain degree, Beijing knows that in fact they are probably not better off if we think of this as a competition. And for them, they want to portray that this is a binary choice. We're either cooperating on Beijing's terms, right? And Beijing's terms of cooperation is Beijing gets to compete and we get to cooperate, right? And either we're doing that or we're in conflict, right? It's a Cold War, right? And in fact, we're insisting from a US perspective is that no, we're in a competition. We get to compete on what we choose to compete on, and you can compete on what you choose to compete on. Both of us don't want conflict, right? And we'll cooperate where we both are interested, right? And to me, that actually leads to a degree of strategic stability. It means that the interactions aren't necessarily the same as what they were before, but it leads potentially to strategic stability.
But to your point, though, and I like the way you're laying out it's a very complex but very simplified version of what's going on here between the three different steady states, if you will. But don't you have to call the other party out in a game of poker and call their bluff at some point and say, no, you know what, we're not going to just accept, be dictated terms by, Yang Jiechi, but we are going to compete, and you got to really call them out if they really want to go make a run at this, because the peace or conflict dichotomy that they're presenting us with, they're going to keep pushing that narrative and keep stealing us blind. And you almost sometimes have to get closer to conflict to get them to back off and maybe change some of the peace terms from the cooperate schism. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
So I withholding our investment is not conflict, right? Deciding that we're not going to buy cotton from a place that in which forced labor is used to harvest that cotton is not an act of war, right? Now, some may choose to characterize it that way, but we should be very confident in simply saying that, listen, that's not war, right? We can make decisions about where we put our money. We can make decisions about where we place investments. We can make decisions about what our commercial relationships are. right, that are not conflict. And it doesn't, and that's where I sort of, again, I sort of step away from terms like economic war or Cold War, because that's not what we're talking about here, right? It sends us down a path about thinking about this as a conflict, when in fact we are states that have very different sets of interests and very different visions of what the future should look like, and we are going to compete to achieve our objectives, right? And we probably, both sides don't want this to resort to sort of open conflict, given the fact that we're both nuclear powers and the potential of where that leads and the massive losses on both sides that would impose. We're both fairly confident that our systems are better. Now let's see where the chips fall, right?
Yeah.
We're either right or they're right. I have a strong suspicion that we're right if we simply compete.
Well, I guess that is in the current situation. I guess I don't disagree with you. I mean, it would be catastrophic for both sides. But if they start exporting their, we'll call it state-owned capitalism hybrid model across the world, does that not change? Would that be a game changer for you in the sense that, I mean, that's what the big C, big W Cold War, the Soviets were forcing their business model down, acquisition targets, if you want to use a business analogy. Right now, China is just self-contained, but if they start invading other countries and pushing that business model down people's throats, at that point, I think, would you agree we would have to take a different approach?
Well, I mean, in conducting a military invasion of another sovereign state is a step change difference from where we are right now. Encouraging and coercing countries to adopt their model. I mean, they have been doing that. It does not particularly work all that well. I mean, I would just ask Pakistan how well that model is working. So I mean, to a certain degree, I mean, this is how the competition unfolds globally, right? And I think that as this becomes, as countries and as individuals and as investors become aware of the landscape of what's happening, they liked it when they could get access to the PRC market and there wasn't a cost upon them, right? Or they could sort of get things. But as choices are being forced to be made, I'm fairly persuaded by the fact that the attractive power of what they're offering is not all that attractive, and therefore, people love to be able to sort of have their cake and eat it too. But when forced, they usually start to make some decisions. And right now we're hearing from countries around the world that they don't want to be forced to make a choice, and that's often directed at the U.S. But the PRC has also been forcing them to make choices, and therefore it remains to be seen where people will come down.
Well, Matt, we'll end on this. We'd love to have you back, as this is going to be a continuous, I think, hot button issue. It's going to change the way trade and capital flows in the next 10 years. So I appreciate your thoughts. I learned a lot today. This part of the show, we ask a few questions that we've asked all of our guests on season 3. And I'll go off with the first one. They're usually yes or no, or you can put as much or little context as you'd like. First question, now that we have vaccines, would you take one or have you taken it?
I would, and I'm waiting on my number to come up. So
fantastic. Yeah,
so it'll be good.
2021, is it a recession or a recovery year?
Oh, let's be positive today. It's going to be a recovery year.
Absolutely, I agree. What was your number one goal for 2021?
It'd be lovely to get back out of the road to be able to travel again.
Yeah, no doubt. So who in your industry, I mean, you are a thought leader in the U.S.-China relationships, and you're published in Politico and places like that. Who do you read, maybe from the Chinese side, on what's going on in your sector?
To give a quick plug for Bill Bishop and Cynicism, a newsletter that Bill runs that collects PRC publications, party publications, party statements, and he pushes that out probably every other day. Cynicism, if you're going to subscribe to something to give you a sense of what's happening inside the PRC, he is an excellent place to start, and I rely upon him religiously.
Fantastic. That's good. It's a good find. Okay. Is there anything that you're reading today or listening to today that you'd like to share with our audience?
I am. Well, I was just finishing up Bill Hayton's book, The Invention of China, which I found to be a fascinating book about essentially the creation of the idea at the end of the 19th century of China as a nation state, in which China, the location called China, the name had always been associated just with the dynasty before, right? And that language of China, the actual country, was not language that was not adopted until really the end of the Qing dynasty and the creation of the Republic of China, and then has obviously gone on as the People's Republic sort of took form. And that's an interesting sort of way in which to think about it, as opposed to sort of the narrative that is out there is this sort of 5,000 year unchanging history, when in fact, like the idea of the country is in fact quite new. And that I thought was a fascinating take on things.
That's great. I mean, I never knew that. I mean, and I did know it, but I hadn't thought of it that way. I mean, they're almost as young of a country, from a unified standpoint as we are.
Yeah, I mean, the People's Republic is 71 years old.
Right.
They've had 10 leaders in that period of time. Some very short and removed violently or in other ways, and others that had much longer reigns. And that idea of what it is actually not all that new, but as like a lot of countries do, is they also create a narrative of their own history, right? And the party, I think, specializes very much in creating a narrative about what the PRC is and what the Chinese people are, and that the party and the Chinese people are inseparable. But as we all know, political parties, aren't completely aligned with their own populations, never have been, never will be. And we should look at it maybe through that lens. I mean, it is not as if there's one political party that represents all Americans, right? So
right.
I think those are important things to kind of keep in mind, and it's helped me sort of rethink, some of the accepted wisdom, right? We have this idea about what the PRC is, right, and how they act in the world, and we should be somewhat critical of some of that received wisdom, and really push ourselves to sort of understand what's actually going on in a much deeper way.
Contrived wisdom, I like that. Oh, what is your favorite podcast besides Non-Beta Alpha, of course?
I am listening to the London Review of Books History of Ideas. I think it's it's called Talking Politics, History of Ideas. I found this someone recommended it to me. Fascinating, sort of going through sort of each show is a different review of a philosopher, usually a political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes and Francis Fukuyama, and sort of working through Mary Wollstonecraft, working through different philosophers and what their thoughts are. Really quite interesting.
Matt, I could talk to you for days. I appreciate you coming on the show. We'd love to have you back in the future and stay in touch. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. This is great. I appreciate it.
Take care.
This show is brought to you by StatusJet. Elevate your status. Fly anywhere, anytime, and experience the difference. Visit statusjet.com to charter your private jet today. Thanks for listening to this episode of Non-Beta Alpha. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube so you never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or simply share this episode with your friends. And now you know.
price references and market forecasts correspond to the date of this recording. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. The information contained in this podcast does not constitute research or recommendation from Non-Beta Alpha Inc., Wentworth Management Services LLC, or any of their affiliates to the listener. Neither Non-Beta Alpha Inc., Wentworth Management Services LLC, nor any of their affiliates make any representation or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of the statements or any information contained in this podcast, and any liability therefore including in respect of direct, indirect, or consequential loss or damage is expressly disclaimed. The views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily those of Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC, and Non-Beta Alpha Inc. and Wentworth Management Services LLC are not providing any financial, economic, legal, accounting, or tax advice or recommendations in this podcast. In addition, the receipt of this podcast by any listener is not to be taken as constituting the giving of investment advice by Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC to that listener, nor to constitute such person a client of any affiliate of Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC. This does not constitute an offer to buy or sell any security. Investments in security may not be suitable for all investors. An investment of any security may involve risk and the potential loss of your initial investment. Investors should review all risk factors before investing. Investors should perform their own due diligence before considering any investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investment products, insurance, and annuity products are not FDIC insured, not bank guaranteed, not insured by a federal government agency, may lose value.